The legislative Lancaster House conferences held between 1960 and 1963 were organized by the imperialists in reaction to the loss of the Mau Mau War. Nearly a decade after the defeat of the imperialist East African Army in the War of 1939 to 1940, the imperialists created the Afrocentric Kenya Land and Freedom Army. This became the military wing of various political groups in Kenya, sponsored by the imperialists. It was largely dominated by populations associated with the Scottish Industrial Missions and the Presbyterian Church, who operated in central Kenya. The Mau Mau War began in 1952 and ended in 1957, with total subjugation of the imperialists and their African fighters in the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. The Scottish Presbyterians suggested that they be allowed to assume administration of the territory previously allocated to them in the Uganda scheme. This was rejected, and so they recruited the Dorobo, Nubians and the Bajuni into their army. After the defeat, their fighters began to masquerade as native populations and began to push for self-rule in Kenya. After the disbandment of the Uganda scheme in 1920 and declaration of colony by Edward Northey, the Balfour Report of 1926 suggested that various religious organizations, that previously held territories in the Uganda scheme, be granted land in Arabia. The suggestion was inspired by the foundational background of various religious movements. The ratification of the Statute of Westminster 1931 culminated in the adoption and implementation of recommendations captured in the Balfour Report or the Balfour Declaration. This way, the religious organizations could not claim territories in the African territories of the Prester John. The Prester John who reigned as King of Abyssinia at the time was John Albert, also called Emperor Johannes. His father, Jean-Jacques, was also called Prester John. The Copts referred to him as Moses the Abyssinian, the Bishop of Arabs. The Arabs referred to Jean-Jacques as Sharif Muhammad, the Emir of Mecca. The South Arabians called him Sultan Salim, the Prince of Wales. The Statute of Westminster 1931 highlights the relationship between the government of His Majesty the King of Britain, and the imperialists who dominated the British Parliament. It relieved the king and the British government of their administrative responsibilities to the territories whose administration was claimed to have been transferred to the British government by the imperialists. Such colonies became independent nations referred to as dominions or republics. The Statute of Westminster would not apply to Kenya as it was part of the Prester John's territory. In 1959, the Kadu coalition government was created in Nakuru, by Daniel Moi and Michael Blundell. The Afrikaners of Rift Valley claimed to have taken neutral positions during the Mau Mau War. For this reason, they granted themselves self-rule. They claimed the Rift Valley regions of Kenya as their own country. Moi and Blundell led a delegation from the Rift Valley in the legislative conferences. Oginga Odinga on the other hand led the Kavirondo delegation. In his book, Not Yet Uhuru, Oginga narrates how imperialists made Josakwa a chief. He states that the king of Josakwa refused to welcome the imperialists and one of his servants called Josakwa, took it up to himself to deliver Josakwa to the colonialists. According to Oginga, it was the cooperation of Josakwa with the colonialists that saved Josakwa from their own king and his Arab supporters. He claims that it was the Arabs who first referred to the Luos as Kavirondo. Early visitors took over the name Kavirondo, which the Arab caravans had once used, and gave the same name to all the peoples living in Nyanza, though they comprise totally distinct groups. Josakwa is a subtribe of the Luo race. Kavirondo on the other hand refers to the squatters who live among the Luo natives. Therefore, the Kavirondo being foreigners, their settlements were part of the colony, which was a territory of the East African Protectorate. Oginga tells the Kavirondo that their settlements are part of a colony, meaning you have no land, the land belongs to the King of England. The King of England in this context refers to the Prester John. Throughout the period in which the British government was involved in the administration of the East African Protectorate, they did so on behalf of the Prester John. The British monarchy did not claim Kenya as its colony. Oginga identifies with the Kavirondo, and appears as to the affairs of the Kavirondo in Kenya. There is a clear distinction between the Luo and the Kavirondo. Throughout the colonial period, the Luos were the subject of punitive colonial expeditions conducted by John Ainsworth and William Hobley in Nyanza. Charles William Hobley led the colonial military unit known as the Nandi. The imperialists were also joined by a section of Luos who formed unit referred to as Jo Kisumwa. Jo Kisumwa was a branch of the Skin Corps. Others branches were formed by Kavirondo groups drawn from the Saniaka, such as Gisho and Nyangori among others. In 1920, the Convention of Associations led by Lord Delamere were disgruntled by John Ainsworth's native reserve policy and its manner of implementation. They wrote to the monarch in Britain, informing the government in London, that John Ainsworth and his men had reintroduced slavery in the Protectorate in the form of colonial land policy through which they deprived the natives of their land. The imperialist administrators deployed their askaris to the native territories. They included Indian policemen, corps appointed from the Kavirondo and the Nubians. At this point, the Nandi fighters from Bengal had been assimilated by the Saniaka, and so they were also Kavirondo. John Ainsworth's native land policy, native taxation policy, and forceful implementation of such policies attracted drastic actions. The monarch reminded the imperialists that they have no administrative mandate in the British East Africa. They did not recognize John Ainsworth's policies that reduced natives to slaves in their own country. The imperialists' territorial claims and their colonial activities became the Indian question. His Majesty, the King in Britain made declarations and issued orders whose implementation effectively addressed the Indian question. The imperialists and their associates from Asia, being foreigners, were blocked from exercising certain rights and privileges including ownership of land and property in the East African Protectorate. These foreign populations were also barred from holding administrative positions in the land, or any position giving them priority over the natives. Such orders are recorded in the White Paper 1923 or the Command Paper 1922 of 1923. Imperialist elements in the British Parliament rejected Delamere's push for reinstatement of dignity to the natives of the land. Archdeacon Owen of the CMS, in collaboration with Monsignor Titus Brandsma's men in Kavirondo, introduced politics of activism in the land. They established the Kavirondo Welfare Association, and used the movement to push for imperialists' agenda in the form of grievances. They demanded for reinstatement of colonial administration. They also called for the Kavirondo to be granted similar status as the Luo natives. They recruited young natives, especially from the Luo clans claiming to be descendants of Omia, such as Karachuanyo and those from Kanyamwa who followed Ogata Okumu. In reality, the imperialists were only taking advantage of internal leadership wrangles among the Luo-speaking natives. The king chose his vassals from the Kengo clan. A section of the Luo, referring to themselves as the Lang, preferred chieftains appointed from Omia clan. The king and majority of the Luo-speaking natives felt that the Lango clans had heavily mingled with the Kavirondo, and that the Omia leaned towards the imperialists. Due to multiple cases of mutiny, the king and his allies doubted Nubian loyalty and feared that they had passed such qualities to the Omia clan. For this reason the king turned to the Awiti clan, and chose Ogola Aik of Karatang as his vassal among the Lango. Jo Karatang and the Awiti by extension, stayed loyal to the king. Ogata Okumu and his Kavirondo supporters from Kanyamwa, who now settled at Korando, claimed that Ogata was the legitimate chieftain of the Lango. They invited William Hobley to help them install Ogata as king. To the north of Karatang, Odara of the Kango clan was ruling as king. Waware, also called Jokawango, were also among native populations who were under Odara Kango. The territories under the two kings, Odara Kango and Ogola Aik of Karatang, became targets of the imperialists' punitive expeditions. The name Jamwa is used in Luo land to refer to the Amwa clans and the Kavirondo. Ogata Okumu and his fighters from Kanyamkago Kamat and Kanyango were part of the Lengo clans, who had mingled with the Kavirondo from Kanyamwa. Also and the Kavirondo of Kanyamwa were Jokamageta and Wasweta. These are mixed populations of the Saniaka such as the Renyi and the Luos from Sakwakawak. However, the rebels from Sakwakawak did not consider themselves as Lang, and so they only arrived in Winam as fighters in the army of Kisumwa. Therefore Jasakwa, whom Oginga talks about in his book as an ally of the imperialists, was either Ochuadho of Sakwakawak in Tanzania, or Ogata Okumu of Kamageta, who settled in Kanyamwa before moving to Korando in Kisumu. However, the connection between Oginga and the two men from Sakwa Kawak cannot be established. While Ogata rebelled against the king at Karangu, Ochuadho rebelled in Musoma. Oginga's Jasakwa was more of a traitor than a rebel, since he does not record any kind of military engagements with the king. Therefore, Oginga disguised himself as Jasakwa, and symbolically referred to himself as Jasakwa and bragged about his acts of betrayal. In real sense, Oginga was Jakavarando, and had no business in native affairs.